The stars looked peaceful through the viewing window of the New Horizon, as Commander Jake Morrison checked the navigation readings one more time. The exploration vessel had been cruising through this sector for 3 weeks without finding anything more interesting than a few dead planets and some scattered asteroids. Jake ran his hand through his dark hair and glanced at the crew stations around him. Lisa Carter sat at the pilot controls, her fingers dancing across the interface as she made minor course corrections. The blonde woman had been flying ships for over 10 years and could navigate through an asteroid field blindfolded if needed. Next to her, Danny Walsh worked on the engineering console, his red hair messy from running his hands through it while he solved technical problems. The young man could fix anything that broke on the ship and usually improved it in the process. Amy Rodriguez monitored the communications array from her station near the back of the bridge. The dark-haired woman kept track of all signals in the area and maintained contact with Earth Command. So far, the only messages had been routine status reports, but she stayed alert for anything unusual. Jake walked over to the main display showing their current position near the edge of human territory. This region of space remained mostly unexplored, except for a few automated probes that had passed through years earlier. The mission orders were simple: map the area, catalog any interesting phenomena, and report back to headquarters in 6 months. "Anything on the sensors, Danny?" Jake asked as he stopped beside the engineering station. Danny shook his head while adjusting some controls. "Nothing but empty space and cosmic radiation. This whole sector seems pretty dead to me." Amy suddenly straightened at her console and pressed her earpiece tighter. "Wait, I'm getting something. Multiple contacts coming in fast from the outer system." Lisa immediately changed course and increased power to the engines. "How many ships are we talking about?" "At least 6 vessels, maybe more. They're moving. Faster than anything I've seen before." Amy's voice carried a note of concern as she worked to get clearer readings. Jake moved to the captain's chair and activated the main screen. The display showed several red dots approaching their position at incredible speed. The computer calculated their arrival time at less than 5 minutes. "Are they responding to our standard greeting signals?" Jake asked while studying the tactical display. Amy shook her head. "No response on any frequency. They're not even acknowledging that we're here." The unknown ships appeared on the main viewer as dark, angular vessels unlike anything in human databases. Their hulls seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, making them difficult to see clearly against the starfield. Strange energy patterns flickered along their surfaces like electrical storms. "Those don't look friendly," Lisa muttered as she prepared evasive maneuvers. Jake opened the ship-wide communication channel. "All hands, this is the captain. We have unknown vessels approaching our position. Everyone report to emergency stations and prepare for possible hostile contact." The lead alien ship suddenly fired a brilliant blue beam that struck the New Horizon shields. The entire vessel shook violently as power fluctuated throughout the ship. Warning alarms began sounding from multiple stations. "Shields down to 60%, Danny called out while his hands flew over the engineering controls. "These weapons are way more advanced than ours." Lisa tried to turn the ship away from the attackers, but more beams struck their hull. The New Horizon was fast for a human vessel, but these alien ships moved like fighters despite being much larger. "Amy, send a distress signal to Earth Command right now," Jake ordered while gripping his chair as another blast rocked the ship. "I'm trying, but they're jamming our communications," Amy replied with frustration clear in her voice. "The signal won't get through their interference." The alien vessels surrounded the New Horizon in a perfect formation that prevented any escape route. Jake realized these weren't random pirates or explorers. This was a coordinated military operation, carried out by beings who knew exactly what they were doing. A new voice suddenly came through the ship's speakers, speaking in heavily accented English. "Human vessel, you will surrender immediately or be destroyed. Lower your defenses and prepare to be boarded." Jake looked at his crew and saw the determination in their eyes. None of them wanted to give up without a fight. But the New Horizon was an exploration ship with minimal weapons against what appeared to be warships. "This is Commander Jake Morrison of the Earth vessel New Horizon. We are on a peaceful scientific mission. Why are you attacking us? You are now property of the Zephyrian Empire. The alien voice replied coldly. Resistance will result in termination of all specimens. More weapon beams struck the ship and the lights flickered as power systems began failing. Danny worked desperately to keep the engines online, but the damage was too severe. "Jake, we've got boarding pods attaching to the hull," Lisa reported, while watching her tactical display. "They're cutting through the outer airlock." Jake stood up and moved toward the weapons locker near the bridge entrance. "Everyone grab a weapon and get ready. We're not going down without a fight." The four humans armed themselves with the small collection of sidearms stored on the exploration vessel. The weapons were designed for personal protection rather than military combat, but they were better than nothing. Heavy footsteps echoed through the corridor outside the bridge as the alien boarding party moved through the ship. Jake could hear his crew members in other sections trying to resist, but the sounds of fighting ended quickly. The bridge door exploded inward, and tall figures in dark armor poured into the room. The aliens stood over 7 feet high with reptilian features and glowing red eyes visible through their helmet visors. Their weapons looked like they could cut through steel with ease. Jake and his crew opened fire, but their bullets bounced harmlessly off the alien armor. The invaders responded with energy weapons that created stunning electrical fields rather than deadly beams. Lisa was the first to fall, her body convulsing as the electrical charge overwhelmed her nervous system. Danny and Amy collapsed moments later, leaving Jake standing alone against 6 armored aliens. Jake kept firing until his weapon ran empty, then grabbed a metal tool from Danny's workstation to use as a club. The alien seemed amused by his continued resistance rather than angry. The largest alien stepped forward and spoke in that same accented English. "This one shows promise. The arena crowds will enjoy watching a fighter." Jake swung the improvised weapon at the alien's helmet, but a stunning blast caught him in the chest before he could connect. His body seized up as electricity coursed through his muscles, and everything went black. The last thing Jake saw before losing consciousness was the alien commander studying him with those glowing red eyes as if evaluating a piece of merchandise rather than a human being. Washington, November 8, 2024. The Federal Reserve raised the benchmark interest rate by 0.25%, marking its 4th increase this year to combat high inflation. The Fed chair stated this measure aims to control rising prices and support economic stability. Jake woke up in a metal cage barely large enough for him to stand upright. His head throbbed from the electrical weapon that had knocked him unconscious, and his whole body ached from lying on the cold floor. The air smelled of alien machinery and something that reminded him of sulfur. Through the bars of his cage, Jake could see he was in some kind of holding area with dozens of other prisoners from different species. Most of them looked defeated and broken, sitting quietly in their own small cells. Some had multiple arms or scales instead of skin, while others appeared almost human, except for strange colored eyes or unusual height. A guard walked past Jake's cage without even looking at him. The alien wore the same dark armor from the boarding party, but this one was smaller and moved with less authority. Jake noticed the weapon on the guard's belt and began planning how he might get close enough to grab it. "Do not even think about it, human." The voice came from the cage next to Jake's, where a reptilian being with green scales and yellow eyes watched him carefully. "I am called Creton, and I have been here for many cycles. The guards are stronger than they appear, and their weapons will kill rather than stun if they feel threatened." Jake moved closer to the bars between their cages. "How long have you been imprisoned here?" "Long enough to see many new arrivals come and go. Most do not survive their first appearance in the arena." Creton's voice carried the weight of someone who had seen too much suffering. "Arena?" Jake asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "The Zephyrians force prisoners to fight for the entertainment of their people. It is how they break the spirit of conquered species and show their dominance over the galaxy." Jake looked around at the other prisoners and noticed how few of them seemed to have any fight left. Their captors had done this so many times that they had turned it into an efficient system for crushing hope. The sound of heavy footsteps announced the arrival of someone important. War Commander Vex Thule entered the holding area, his red eyes scanning the cages until they fixed on Jake. The alien leader was even more imposing without his helmet, with scarred features and sharp teeth that showed when he spoke. "The human specimen appears to be recovering well," Vexithul said to one of his subordinates. "Prepare him for tomorrow's matches." The crowd grows bored with the usual entertainment. 2 guards opened Jake's cage and attached metal restraints to his wrists and ankles. The chains were heavy but allowed enough movement for him to walk. They led him through corridors filled with more cages and eventually into a large circular room. The arena was bigger than any stadium Jake had ever seen on Earth. Thousands of Zephyrians filled the seats around the fighting pit, their voices creating a roar of excitement as they waited for the battles to begin. High above the crowd, a viewing box contained what appeared to be important officials watching the proceedings. Jake was pushed into a preparation area under the arena where other fighters waited for their turns. Most of them looked like seasoned gladiators with scars covering their bodies and weapons adapted to their particular species. They studied Jake with curiosity, rather than hostility. "First time in the pit?" asked a large being with 4 arms and skin like rough leather. "My name is Gorak. I have survived 43 matches, which makes me practically ancient in this place." Jake nodded and looked around at the various weapons hanging on the walls. Most of them appeared to be designed for creatures much different than humans, but he spotted a few items that might work with his anatomy. "What should I expect out there?" Jake asked, while examining a metal staff that seemed about the right size. Gorak laughed, but the sound held no humor. "Expect to die quickly and try to make it entertaining for the crowd. If you bore them, they will demand something more painful than a simple death." The gates to the arena opened, and Jake was pushed forward into the bright lights of the fighting pit. The roar of the crowd was deafening as thousands of aliens cheered for blood and violence. Jake had never felt so alone in his entire life. His opponent was already waiting in the center of the arena. The creature stood nearly 8 feet tall with multiple rows of teeth and claws that could tear through metal. It had won many previous fights based on the scars covering its body and the confident way it moved. Jake gripped the metal staff he had chosen and tried to remember everything he had learned about combat during his military training. The creature was bigger and stronger, but it might also be slower and less adaptable than a human. The crowd fell silent as War Commander Vexthul stood up in the viewing box. His voice echoed throughout the arena as he announced the match between the newcomer human and the veteran gladiator known as Razorclaw. When the starting signal sounded, Razorclaw charged directly at Jake with incredible speed. Jake rolled to the side at the last moment and swung his staff at the creature's legs. The impact sent vibrations up his arms but caused the alien to stumble slightly. The crowd seemed surprised that Jake had avoided the first attack. Most new fighters were killed within seconds of entering the arena. Jake realized he needed to keep moving and use his smaller size as an advantage. Razorclaw recovered quickly and slashed with its massive claws, missing Jake by inches. Jake spun around and struck the creature in the back with his staff, but the alien's thick hide absorbed most of the impact. Jake began to understand that this fight would require more than just strength or speed. He needed to think like a human rather than trying to match his opponent's natural weapons. Humans had survived and thrived on Earth by using intelligence and tools rather than claws and fangs. Jake noticed that Razorclaw always attacked in straight lines and seemed to have trouble changing direction quickly. Jake began using the arena itself as a weapon, leading his opponent into the walls and obstacles scattered around the fighting pit. The crowd grew more excited as the match continued longer than anyone expected. Jake was not only surviving, but actually landing hits on a creature that had killed dozens of other gladiators. After several more exchanges, Jake managed to trip Razorclaw using his staff and the creature's own momentum. The alien crashed to the ground hard enough to shake the arena floor. Jake quickly pressed his advantage and struck repeatedly at what appeared to be vulnerable spots. The crowd erupted in amazement as Razorclaw stopped moving. Jake stood over his defeated opponent, breathing hard but alive. He had won his first gladiator match against impossible odds. War Commander Vexthul stared down at Jake with what might have been respect mixed with concern. The human had just done something that should have been impossible according to everything the Zephyrians knew about conquered species. 3 months had passed since Jake's first victory in the arena, and he had survived 15 more matches that should have killed him. The other prisoners now looked at him with something between hope and disbelief. No one had expected the human to last more than a few fights. but Jake kept finding ways to defeat opponents much larger and stronger than himself. Jake sat in his cage studying the guard rotation schedule he had memorized over the past weeks. Every guard followed the same pattern at the same times, which told him the Zephyrians relied heavily on routine rather than adapting to new situations. This weakness could be useful if he ever got the chance to escape. Cretan had become Jake's closest ally among the prisoners, sharing information about the prison layout and the habits of their captors. The reptilian warrior had given up hope of freedom long ago, but Jake's continued survival had started to change his thinking. "The guards are getting nervous about your popularity with the crowds," Cretan whispered during the daily feeding time. "War Commander Vexthul has been asking questions about human psychology and combat capabilities." Jake nodded while eating, the bland nutrient paste they were given twice each day. "Have you learned anything new about the prison sections we haven't seen yet? There is a research facility 3 levels down where they keep prisoners for experiments rather than gladiator matches. Some of the guards mentioned they have other humans there." Jake's heart jumped at the possibility that his crew might still be alive. He had assumed Lisa, Danny, and Amy were dead after the attack on their ship, but the Zephyrians seemed to value live specimens for various purposes. "How would someone get down to those levels?" Jake asked quietly. Cretan studied his friend carefully. "You are thinking about escape, which is madness. Even if you could reach the research levels, how would you get off this planet?" Jake had been thinking about that problem for weeks. The prison was located on the Zephyrian capital world of Kethvar, surrounded by military installations and defensive systems. Even if they could break out of the facility, they would need a ship and knowledge of safe routes through enemy space. That evening, Jake was taken to fight against 2 opponents at once, something that had never happened before in the arena's history. The crowd was larger than usual and seemed especially excited about this special match. Jake realized the Zephyrians were testing him to see if he had reached his limits. His opponents were both experienced gladiators who had worked together in previous team matches. One was fast with razor-sharp claws, while the other was heavily armored and carried a massive club. They coordinated their attacks to prevent Jake from using his usual tactics of mobility and environment manipulation. Jake spent the first part of the fight simply trying to avoid getting killed as the 2 aliens worked together to corner him. The crowd cheered every time he barely escaped their coordinated strikes, enjoying the spectacle of the human being pushed to his breaking point. But Jake was studying his opponents even while running for his life. He noticed that the fast one always attacked first while the heavily armored one followed up to prevent escape. If he could disrupt their timing, he might be able to turn their coordination against them. Jake pretended to stumble and fall, making it look like exhaustion had finally caught up with him. The fast opponent rushed in for the killing blow while the armored one moved to block any escape route. At the last second, Jake rolled aside and grabbed a handful of sand from the arena floor. When the fast alien overshot his position, Jake threw the sand at its eyes and then kicked its legs out from under it. The creature crashed directly into its armored partner, and both fighters went down in a tangle of limbs and weapons. Jake quickly grabbed the dropped club and used it to finish both opponents before they could recover. The crowd erupted in the loudest cheers he had ever heard, clearly impressed that one human had defeated 2 veteran gladiators through cleverness rather than strength. War Commander Vexthul looked troubled as he watched Jake acknowledge the crowd's approval. After the match, Jake was taken to a different holding area instead of back to his usual cage. This room was larger and contained several other successful gladiators from different species. "Welcome to the champion quarters," said Gorak, who had survived his own matches long enough to earn better treatment. "Only fighters who prove themselves exceptional get moved here." Jake looked around and noticed the accommodations were significantly better than the regular prison cages. There were actual beds, better food, and even some recreational items to pass the time between matches. It was still imprisonment, but with more comfortable conditions. "Why do they treat the champions differently?" Jake asked while examining the improved living space. "Because we are valuable entertainment that generates profit for the Empire," replied Zilnara, a being with pale blue skin and large dark eyes who possessed some kind of telepathic abilities. "They want us healthy and motivated to put on good shows." Jake realized this was actually an opportunity rather than just better treatment. The champion fighters had more freedom of movement within the facility and better access to information about the prison's operations. They were also taken to different areas for training and medical treatment. Over the following weeks, Jake used his new privileges to map out more of the facility and identify potential weak points in the security system. He discovered that the research levels were accessible through maintenance tunnels that connected all parts of the complex. Jake also began building relationships with champions from other species, learning about their backgrounds and what had brought them to this place. Many of them had been leaders of resistance movements or military officers from worlds conquered by the Zephyrian Empire. "We represent the best fighters from dozens of different worlds," Zilnara explained during one of their conversations. "If we could work together instead of fighting each other, we might have enough skill and knowledge to actually escape this place." The idea of organizing all the champions into a coordinated escape attempt seemed impossible, but Jake realized it might be the only way to save not just himself, but potentially hundreds of prisoners throughout the facility. Jake began having quiet conversations with different champions, testing their willingness to consider escape rather than accepting their fate as entertainment. Most of them had given up hope long ago, but a few still burned with the desire for freedom. The plan that began forming in Jake's mind was more ambitious than anything attempted in the arena's history. It would require precise timing, cooperation between natural enemies, and a level of coordination that their captors would never expect from mere prisoners. Jake started sharing his knowledge of Zephyrian routines and weaknesses with the other champions while learning everything he could about their various skills and abilities. If they were going to attempt the impossible, they would need every advantage they could get. Jake had been planning the escape for 2 months when he finally got the chance to reach the research levels. A maintenance problem in the champion quarters required repairs that would take several hours, so the guards moved all the top fighters to a temporary holding area near the facility's central hub. The new location gave Jake access to service corridors he had never seen before, and during the confusion of the move, he managed to slip away from the group. He had memorized the facility layout from conversations with various prisoners and workers, so he knew exactly which direction would take him toward the research sections. The corridors in this part of the facility were cleaner and better lit than the prison areas. Jake could hear the hum of sophisticated equipment behind sealed doors as he made his way deeper into the complex. Scientists and technicians moved between laboratories, focused on their work and paying little attention to their surroundings. Jake found an empty storage room where he could hide while studying the activity patterns in this section. He watched through a small window as various aliens in white coats moved between different labs carrying data tablets and specimen containers. The security here relied more on access cards than armed guards. After waiting for the right moment, Jake followed a group of technicians toward what appeared to be the main research area. The doors required special clearance to open, but Jake noticed they stayed unlocked when multiple people were moving through them frequently. Jake slipped inside during a shift change and found himself in a vast laboratory filled with examination tables, monitoring equipment, and holding cells designed for live subjects. The scale of the operation was much larger than he had imagined, with dozens of different species being studied simultaneously. In the far corner of the lab, Jake spotted 3 familiar figures in one of the holding cells. Lisa, Danny, and Amy were alive but looked thin and exhausted from months of captivity. They wore simple prisoner clothing and had various monitoring devices attached to their bodies. Jake waited until the area was mostly empty before making his move. He found a technician's access card on an unattended desk and used it to unlock his crew's cell. Lisa looked up in shock as the door opened, unable to believe Jake was actually standing there. "Jake? How did you get down here?" Lisa whispered as she stood up on shaky legs. "Long story. Are you 3 okay? Can you walk?" Jake helped Danny and Amy to their feet while scanning the area for guards. "They've been running tests on us for months," Danny said quietly, "trying to understand human physiology and technology. They know way more about Earth's capabilities than we thought." Amy pointed toward a computer terminal near their cell. "They've been analyzing everything from our ship's database, navigation routes, military capabilities, population centers. They're planning something big." Jake moved to the terminal and began accessing the files that Amy indicated. What he found made his blood run cold. The Zephyrians had been preparing for a massive invasion of human space using intelligence gathered from captured ships and crews over the past several years. The invasion fleet was nearly ready to launch, with hundreds of warships assembled at strategic points throughout the Empire. Their plan involved simultaneous attacks on Earth's major colonies followed by a direct assault on the homeworld itself. "We have to warn Earth," Jake said while copying as much data as he could onto a portable storage device. "How?" Lisa asked. "We're prisoners on an alien planet in the middle of their empire." Jake looked at his crew and realized they didn't know about his months in the gladiator arena, or the escape plan he had been developing with the other champions. He quickly explained what had happened since their capture, and what he hoped to accomplish. "You want to steal Zephyrian ships and fight our way out of their capital system?" Danny stared at Jake like he had lost his mind. "It's the only way to get this intelligence back to Earth before the invasion launches," Jake replied while helping them remove the monitoring equipment. "And we're not doing it alone." Jake led his crew through the maintenance tunnels back toward the champion quarters, taking a longer route to avoid the areas with heavy security. Along the way, he explained how he had been building alliances with fighters from dozens of different worlds. When they reached the champion section, Jake introduced his crew to Cretan, Gorak, Zilnara, and the other gladiators who had agreed to participate in the escape attempt. The diverse group represented some of the most skilled warriors and tacticians from across the galaxy. The plan requires coordination between multiple teams hitting different targets simultaneously, Jake explained to the assembled group. "We need to disable the facility's communications, secure transportation, and create enough chaos to cover our escape." Zilnara used her telepathic abilities to help coordinate the timing between teams that would be spread throughout the facility. Her mental link would allow them to synchronize their actions without relying on communication devices that could be intercepted. Gorak had identified the armory where confiscated weapons from various species were stored. His team would secure better equipment for the escape, while Jake's group focused on reaching the vehicle bay where captured ships were kept for study. Cretan knew the guard schedules better than anyone, and would lead the team responsible for creating diversions to draw security forces away from the critical areas. His knowledge of Zephyrian military procedures made him invaluable for predicting their responses. The escape would take place during the next major arena event, when most of the facility's attention would be focused on the gladiator matches. Jake had deliberately lost his last few fights to make his opponents overconfident and ensure he would be scheduled for the main event. Lisa, Danny, and Amy were given simple but important tasks that matched their technical skills. Lisa would handle piloting duties once they reached the ships. Danny would work on disabling security systems, and Amy would monitor communications to track the facility's response to their escape. Jake spent the remaining time before the escape teaching his crew basic combat techniques he had learned in the arena. They would need to be able to defend themselves during the chaotic breakout, even though they weren't trained fighters. The night before the escape, Jake lay on his bed thinking about everything that could go wrong with their plan. They were about to attempt something that had never been done in the history of the Zephyrian Empire, using a group of prisoners who had been enemies until recently. But Jake had learned something important during his months of captivity. The Zephyrians were powerful and technologically advanced, but they were also predictable and overconfident. They had conquered so many worlds so easily that they couldn't imagine their prisoners working together successfully. Jake looked around, at the sleeping champions from a dozen different species, and realized they represented something the Empire had never faced before. Not just individual fighters, but a coordinated force united by their shared desire for freedom and revenge against their captors. Tomorrow would determine whether Jake's faith in cooperation over domination was justified, or whether they would all die trying to achieve the impossible. The arena was more crowded than Jake had ever seen it as thousands of Zephyrians gathered for what they expected to be the final defeat of the stubborn human gladiator. War Commander Vexathul had arranged for Jake to face 3 opponents simultaneously, believing this would finally end the human's unlikely winning streak. Jake walked into the fighting pit carrying only a simple metal blade, but his mind was focused on the escape plan rather than the upcoming battle. In exactly 10 minutes, Zilnara would send the telepathic signal that would trigger coordinated attacks throughout the facility. His opponents were the largest and most dangerous fighters the arena had ever seen. One was a massive creature with stone-like skin that could resist almost any weapon. Another moved with lightning speed and had venomous claws, while the third possessed multiple arms and wielded different weapons with each hand. The crowd cheered as the three champions surrounded Jake in the center of the arena. They were confident this would be a quick execution rather than a real fight, since no single gladiator had ever survived against three elite opponents working together. Jake began the fight by running directly toward the stone-skinned creature, confusing both the crowd and his opponents who expected him to try avoiding combat. At the last second, he slid between the creature's legs and struck at a joint he had identified as a weak point during previous matches. The crowd's cheering turned to surprised murmurs as the massive opponent stumbled and fell backward into the path of the multi-armed fighter. Jake immediately rolled away as the venomous creature lunged at where he had been standing just moments before. War Commander Vexthul watched from his viewing box with growing concern as Jake continued to use his opponent's size and aggression against them. The human was fighting with a level of tactical thinking that seemed impossible for a mere prisoner. At exactly the planned moment, Jake felt Zilnara's telepathic signal touch his mind. Throughout the facility, champion fighters began their coordinated escape attempt while the guards' attention was focused on the arena spectacle. Cretan led his team in attacking the main guard stations, using weapons they had secretly gathered over the past weeks. The reptilian warrior's knowledge of Zephyrian tactics allowed his group to strike at the exact moments when security rotations left certain areas vulnerable. Gorak and his fighters stormed the armory, overwhelming the guards. Through sheer ferocity and determination, within minutes they had secured advanced weapons and were distributing them to other escaped prisoners throughout the facility. Danny worked frantically at a computer terminal to disable the automated security systems, while Amy monitored communication channels to track the guards' response to the breakout. Lisa prepared the captured human ship they had found in the research section, bringing its engines online for immediate departure. Back in the arena, Jake continued his impossible fight against three opponents while using the battle as cover for the escape happening throughout the facility. The crowd was so focused on the spectacular combat that they didn't notice the emergency signals beginning to flash on security displays. Jake managed to trip the multi-armed fighter into the venomous creature, causing both aliens to tangle together, long enough for him to focus on the stone-skinned opponent. Using techniques he had learned from watching other species fight, Jake found a way to crack the creature's seemingly impenetrable armor. War Commander Vexthul suddenly received reports of fighting throughout the facility and realized the arena match was a distraction rather than entertainment. He immediately ordered all available guards to contain the prison break, but the coordinated nature of the escape had caught them completely unprepared. Jake delivered the finishing blow to his last opponent, just as the first explosions echoed through the arena from other parts of the facility. The crowd began to panic as they realized something was seriously wrong, creating perfect chaos for the final phase of the escape plan. Zilnara and several other champions fought their way to the arena floor to extract Jake from the pit before security forces could respond. The telepathic alien had been monitoring the progress of all escape teams and knew they had only minutes before Zephyrian reinforcements would arrive. Jake and the rescue team battled through corridors filled with guards and automated defenses as they made their way toward the vehicle bay. The combination of different fighting styles from various species proved devastating against enemies who were used to predictable prison riots. Lisa had the ship ready for immediate departure when Jake's group finally reached the docking area. The vessel was actually Jake's original exploration ship, which the Zephyrians had been studying to understand human technology and capabilities. Danny had managed to disable enough security systems to give them a clear path to space, but Amy reported that Zephyrian warships were already moving to intercept any escaping vessels. The window for escape was closing rapidly as the Empire's military machine responded to the crisis. Cretan and Gorak led the rear guard action that allowed other escaped prisoners to reach various ships throughout the facility. Not everyone would be able to escape, but dozens of fighters from different worlds managed to secure transportation off the planet. Jake took the pilot controls as Lisa worked the navigation systems to plot a course toward human space. The ship lifted off just as Zephyrian fighters arrived at the facility, beginning a running battle that would determine whether their sacrifice had been worth the cost. War Commander Vexthul watched in disbelief as multiple stolen ships broke through his planet's defensive perimeter. The human prisoner he had dismissed as simple entertainment had organized the most successful prison break in the Empire's history. Jake's ship dodged through asteroid fields and nebulae as they raced toward the edge of Zephyrian space, carrying intelligence that could save Earth from invasion. Behind them, other escaped prisoners scattered in different directions, each carrying news of the Empire's weakness to their own worlds. The data Jake had stolen from the research facility contained detailed information about Zephyrian military capabilities, invasion plans, and the locations of worlds that could be liberated by coordinated resistance movements. More importantly, it proved that the seemingly invincible Empire could be defeated by species working together. As they finally reached the safety of neutral space, Jake looked back at his crew and the alien allies who had helped make their escape possible. Zilnara smiled with her large dark eyes while Cretan checked their weapon systems, both committed to continuing the fight against their former captors. Jake opened a communication channel toward Earth and began transmitting the warning that would allow humanity to prepare for the coming war. The Zephyrians had made a critical mistake when they captured him, because they had awakened something they never expected to face. The galaxy was about to learn that humans possessed a unique ability to turn defeat into victory, captivity into conquest, and enemies into allies through the simple refusal to accept that anything was truly impossible.